And with me tonight, Ben Bradshaw, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. Nigel Lawson, Chancellor of the Exchequer under Mrs Thatcher. Jenny Tong, Liberal Democrat peer and health spokesman. The Sun columnist, Jane Moore. And the Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, Douglas Murray. Good, thanks very much. Let's get cracking. You remember the panel haven't seen the questions, so the first one comes to them as a surprise from John Morris, please.
Is Gordon Brown's announcement of an international fund to regenerate Taliban fighters an insult to the families of UK soldiers who have died in Afghanistan?
An insult to the families of soldiers who've died. Jane Moore.
I think it depends entirely on the family involved. I think some families will find it deeply offensive. I think some families will say, well, I didn't want my son or daughter to have died in vain, and maybe if the powers that be have decided that this is the only way forward, then this is what we have to look at. I think that's a very personal way of looking at it. I think generally as a whole, if you broaden the question and talk about the British taxpayer, when I looked at Gordon Brown making these very sort of largesse statements and behaving like a sort of a world statesman, if you like, I just kept thinking, what's happening in this country? The same day that this was announced, we had 2 million of our own pensioners that are now in poverty. We have 3 million people, if not more, in debt, and those are just the ones that are asking for advice. We are financially crippled in this country, so to see that we're suddenly now saying, well, a squillion to you for this and a squillion to you for that, I find galling in the extreme.
So are you against paying Taliban fighters to come over to the side of the Allies? You are absolutely. Leave things as they are.
Totally. Yes.
Okay. Jenny Tong.
We have got to do something about Afghanistan. There has got to be decisions made. Otherwise, many, many, many more British soldiers over not 1 decade, but probably 2 decades are going to lose their lives, together with many more soldiers. So, I mean, we have to do something about it. The mistake from the very beginning was that George Bush concentrated on military action in Afghanistan, thinking somehow he'd be able to win a war, which if he'd looked in his history books, he would know that's pretty well impossible in that part of the world. And I remember there was pledges of lots of money. I don't know how many squillions, Jane, but there's certainly pledges of lots of money in 2001 and onwards for redeveloping
So what about this proposal today at the conference on Afghanistan?
This proposal is an attempt to claw back those young men who've gone to the Taliban because they are their only source of income. If you join the Taliban, they will probably pay you money and they will give you a uniform, and what's more important in Afghanistan, they will feed you. That is often why all over Africa young people join rebel armies and take up arms. It is so that they get food and a way of living.
So you're in favour?
I think that this probably is a measure that will help. I don't know whether it will help completely, but it has to go along with massive redevelopment in Afghanistan and less emphasis on military action.
Douglas Murray.
Well, it's a very difficult issue. What the Allied forces, the NATO forces, are trying to do through this technique is to pretty much replicate what happened in Iraq, that brought Iraq from the brink of civil war to the pretty much stabilized country it currently is. And that's the following. In Iraq, it was the so-called Sunni awakening, where the Allies managed to hive off those people who were paid insurgents, who were, as it were, not ideological militants, and to bring those people away from the ideological militants. That's the same technique that's now being suggested in Afghanistan, that those people who've joined the Taliban for non-ideological reasons can be hived away from the ideological Taliban. Now, that's not going to be a swift tactic. It's not going to show success necessarily fast, but if what happened in Iraq is replicated, it will be successful in the long term.
And even if these people have been blowing up British soldiers, at the roadside, you wouldn't object to them receiving money to stop fighting?
Well, I object to it very much, but
Well,
I also know that as a
is.
pragmatist on these issues, we have to also look at what we can do to bring Afghanistan back to some kind of state of normality, and it's not easy, and anyone who tells you it is fooling you.
Let's hear from some members of the audience. Quite a lot of people with their hands up. The woman here in red and white at the front.
For Jenny's response, do you not think it's more important with the current economic climate? We've been borrowing money from other countries because of the amount of debt we're in. Do you not feel Gordon Brown should concentrate on getting this country back into order so that us that have been unemployed for over a year that cannot get a job because there are no jobs, we can get back into some kind of order than getting money and giving it to other countries?
All
Look
right.
closer to home.
OK, you think the money's being wasted, in other words?
It needs to be back in England. England has got such a problem right now. And we're in the recession. How are we going to get out of it if we just give money to other countries all the time?
Ben Bradshaw.
Well, in response to that point and the point that Jane made, actually the UK's contribution is pretty small compared with most of the other countries. Japan, Germany are all contributing more. But in the end, I agree with Douglas. If this means that we can bring our people home sooner, if this helps bring a lasting peace to Afghanistan, it has to be worth doing. And it's not simply, David, as you implied, handing over a bung or a bribe to Taliban fighters. It's about investing in economic development, in land, so that they can convert to farming, in helping the economic development, as Douglas says, to get those non-ideological, non-Al-Qaeda fighters away from Al-Qaeda. And that's the only hope for Afghanistan. If we don't do anything, you know, Afghanistan was a breeding ground for terrorism. The September the 11th attacks, the July the 7th attacks in London were planned and orchestrated from that region.
How can you invest what you don't already have? We don't have the money to invest.
It depends how much your security matters.
And is it not a fact of life? There is always going to be terrorism. There is always going to be terror. Oh, you can't eradicate it.
What, in Afghanistan, you mean?
Anywhere in the world. There will always be terrorism.
Give up and just allow everyone to bomb you.
We don't have the resources. We cannot be the solution to the world's problems.
No, but this is our problem.
Hold on, Douglas. The woman with black hair there, please. I come to you, Nigel. Yes, you.
I think it's absolutely appalling that the British people and the taxpayers of this country are actually asked to pay for the Taliban, for them to have houses, for us to pay for them to get jobs, when they're actually over there killing our sons and our daughters.
Terrorism pays.
That is actually, it is, for the government to want us in this country to do that, that's an insult to the people, to the families who actually lost their children, and to the British taxpayer in this country. That is actually telling us, the rest of us, we are not worth nothing. And the Taliban are worth more than we are, because we're asked to pay to put them in houses and get them jobs, and they're killing our children.
Your view should that we should what? Fight, just fight.
I think, to be quite honest with you, our boys shouldn't be there anyway, but they are there, so there's nothing we can do about it at this present moment.
All right.
But now to ask us to pay for houses and jobs for the Taliban, to get them down from the mountains, to stop shooting the British soldiers, is absolutely appalling.
Okay.
It shows you what's happening to this country.
Nigel
England.
Lawson.
I must say this somewhat reminds me, this episode, of the old Arab story, a rather cynical one. Which is it better to be, a friend of the British or an enemy of the British? And the answer is better to be an enemy of the British. But if you're an enemy, they buy you. If you're a friend, they sell you. This does represent, at the very beginning of a change of policy. It's not right, but a change of policy is badly needed. The whole idea of sorting out Afghanistan, the British tried to do it in the pomp of the empire in the late 19th century. Couldn't do it. The Russians tried to do it when they were quite powerful. They couldn't do it. It is a complete nonsense. And what we need to do is to keep our eye on the ball. The ball is not nation building in Afghanistan, bringing democracy to Afghanistan. That's their business, if they want that or not.
Absolutely.
Propping up a totally corrupt regime in Afghanistan, which is what it is. Our focus should be Al-Qaeda and other forms of Islamic terrorism. And the question should be, what is the best way of fighting that? Changing Afghanistan, when then they go to Pakistan or they go to Yemen and go to both, is crazy. It is costing an awful lot of money, far too much, and an awful lot of unnecessary lives among our boys there.
But what would your strategy?
I would have a strategy. Say, go back to the drawing board. How are we going to reduce the